I'm thrilled, but very nervous at the same time to be able to do this. I had originally made a set of PowerPoints and I sent it to Wendy, and she kind of suggested that maybe I do something a little less formal and academic, because I was, I guess, talking about statistics and all these things for why there's life after death. So I just made a set of notes on some paper, and I'm just going to talk from my notes. So we'll see how that goes. It's a little different for me, but that's okay. It'll work. So basically, I was born in 1959, and I was born a sensitive, is the term I like to use. I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and that sort of thing really didn't go well with people in those times. It wasn't something that people have a completely different attitude about that today than they did back in the 60s and 70s. So I didn't tell anybody about it. And in fact, I was pretty clueless as to what mediumship was. And even though I was communicating with people on the other side constantly since I was a kid, I just thought that was something my brain could do, and I knew enough not to tell anybody about it. So some of the things that I did when I was young, first of all, I had imaginary friends, like many of us, I think, in this group had. And some interesting things were, there was a group of them that, there were 3 people, a woman and 2 men, and they once gave me a little red pouch. That was an apport. But when I don't even think I was 5 years old. I just accepted it. Well, yeah, the people are giving me a little red pouch. And I was told, you can play with it, but at such and so on time, at such and so on place in the kitchen on the specific table, you have to return it to us and we'll take it back. And I remember putting it on the table and seeing it disappear. And the other thing they told me was, never tell anybody about this. Do not talk about this to anybody. So, okay. I remember when I was a little older, there was suddenly some coins appeared, 2 or 3 coins from the 1800s and 1900s. I still have them. I came to understand later on in life that they were probably apports. They appeared out of nowhere. And I remember my mother and other people in the neighborhood, where did these come from? They just came, like nobody understood. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to put them with the silver coins that my grandma gave me, just keep them there. I went through a stage where I refused to sleep in my bed. I preferred to sleep on the floor, and the reason was because that's how the people slept. But there were these people that I apparently knew. They slept on the floor, so I was going to sleep on the floor. I refused to sleep in my bed. And this is when I was, I'd say, under the age of 12, all this happened. There was also a secret place in the forest where I would go. It was some kind of bush, but I could climb inside the bush because the bush was kind of circular. And I would sit in there and talk to God and sing to God and just have a good old time by myself in there. I'd like to go for walks by myself in forested areas. And I used to play a game called stalking, because I read somewhere that Native Americans, we called them Indians, American Indians back then, they would walk through the woods in a way that wouldn't leave any footsteps or any hints that somebody had walked through. So I would go for hours and practice doing that. And then when I was around 12 or 13 years of age, we went camping up in Maine, and I decided to go for one of my walks again. And I found some birds like on the side of the road. There was a highway near the camp, and the birds were going into the forest. So I followed the birds into the forest. They were in the treetops. I just followed them. I don't know at the time, I wasn't aware of how long this went on for. And then I knew it was time to come back, and I just knew, oh, follow the stream back to the road. So I did. I followed the stream. Then I went back to the road and then back to the camp, and it turned out I was gone for 2 or 3 hours, and the whole camp was looking for me. They thought a bear or something had gotten me. I thought 20 minutes passed, but the innocence of a 12 or 13-year-old, oh, okay, I guess I better be more mindful when I go for walks. I don't want people worrying about me. Another thing that used to happen was, as a teenager, sometimes on long walks, I would talk to myself, and I would hear a response in Old English. At least that's what I called it. It was Old English. So there were a lot of these and thous and this like archaic English. And I remember being very pleased with myself. And I said, oh, what I can do with my brain. This is really cool. Clueless, just totally clueless about what was going on. In middle school, with one of my grandmothers, I said, Grandma, you're going to die before I do probably. So when you die, can you come and visit me from the other side so I know there's life after death? My grandmother said, yeah, of course, I'll do that. And she did, but not until I was almost 30, or I was maybe in my 30s when she finally came around and visited. But it was like everything was all matter of fact. Once, when I was very young, I had asked my parents, what are we going to do if we lose electricity and the lights go out? And they just thought it was one of those questions that kids ask. But then a couple of hours later, we had the big blackout that went on for 14 hours. It went from Ontario, Canada, all the way along the East Coast. That was in 1965. So I did that. Another time I said, what happens if we get in a car accident? Oh, this kid, she just asked questions. Sure enough, we got in a car accident. I still have the scar on my forehead. I had to get a lot of stitches in it. So I kind of made little predictions, I guess. There was another time when I was in my bedroom, I was supposed to be falling asleep, but outside my father and my mother and a couple of other people were talking. And I don't know if it was a stray dog or a neighborhood dog, but came by and my father chased it away. But in my mind, it wasn't my father chasing a dog away. He chased away a tiger. And until I was in my 30s, I had this distinct memory of my father chasing away a tiger. Now, when I met my teacher, Steve, which I'll talk about in a short time, he explained to me that children often have past life memories, and that's what it probably was, some kind of past life memory. And after I told him that, I couldn't remember it anymore. But I mean, I had a clear memory of a tiger. But once I told Steve, it completely disappeared. I also like to stay up and watch the stars from my bedroom window. And one night I was crying and my parents came in and said, why are you crying? And I said, because God is in the stars and I want to go back home. You know, one of these kind of kids. As I was growing up as a young child and into my mid-20s, still not understanding what was going on, I always felt different. And there was a kind of sense of loneliness that I had because I knew I never quite fit in. And even though I had lots of friends, I always felt like I was an outsider. I knew somehow I was different. Now, perhaps some of this feeling of not fitting in was because my father was Jewish and my mother was Catholic. So I just didn't feel like I fit in with either religious group. But I personally now, looking back at it at age 64, I know better. One day, my sister and I, we dressed up and as the Virgin Mary and Mary Magdalene, and then I got beat up by some of the boys, the Catholic boys in the neighborhood. But a lot of this feeling outside of everything was because I was searching for something, but I didn't even know what it was that I was searching for. It was a deep longing and searching. And I was told, I think I was in my 20s or 30s when I was around age 5 or 6, my father told me I was asking questions like, what is wisdom? So, which was kind of unusual for a child that age. I never could talk about most of these things with my siblings, my parents, or friends. And even if I did try, at best they didn't understand, and at worst, I was ridiculed, or worse yet, they might think it was a mental illness. So I was pretty much on my own. So I graduated high school, and I was kind of angry at the world, right? Because I didn't fit in. So what can I do to make myself fit in and gain approval and show that I'm tough and like everybody else? I joined the military. I joined the Army. And I was in for almost 3 years. And the last year and a half, I was actually one of the first female cadets at West Point. But fortunately, academics got me and I was forced to leave because that really wasn't the place for me. Then I went on to civilian college and it was a little better, but not much better. because most of the professors this is now in the 1980s, they took a very materialistic point of view. I had a hard time because some of the students, when they learned I went to West Point, called me a baby and mother killer. You know, this again was right after Vietnam. So I started out majoring in mathematics. I took a physics course for physics with calculus course, and I ended up flunking that because what happened was we had this really complicated problem, and I looked at the math problem and I knew how to solve it with a ratio, a real simple ratio, like down to the decimal point. So when the professor found out about that, he called me up after class, and my grades were not good other than that little weird thing I did. And he took me aside and said, I don't know how you did this, very sarcastically, unless you learned it from another life, but you're obviously not working up to your potential. And then at the end of the semester, he took me aside and said, he's going to flunk me to force me to take the course over because I obviously have more potential in physics than other students and I need to do better in it. So I said, fine. And I dropped my math major and switched over to psychology and ended up majoring in that instead. So I got through and graduated. During my senior year of college, though, I heard about psychic surgery going on in Puerto Rico. I saw a documentary on TV, and I was just like, you had to peel me off the ceiling when I saw that. Yeah, I know it's true. This is really cool. I know what these, this is really cool what they're doing. And also, interestingly, soon after I graduated, the Hudson Valley UFO phenomena was occurring in my area, so I was sighting UFOs. A couple of years after all that, after I graduated college, I met a friend of my father's who turned out to be a pivotal person in my life, one person that was very, very important to my mediumship. His name was Steve Sedlak. I called him Steve, and by then I was in my mid to late 20s, and he was very, very knowledgeable about psychic events and mediumships and everything that I was basically been forbidden to speak about. And he was one of these people that lived more in the other worlds than in this one. He had the ability he had what I call X-ray vision. He could look inside a person's body and see all sorts of ailments and diagnose and heal. He was constantly in communication with spirit. He explained to me that I was basically a medium, without training, of course, that I was basically born that way. I don't think he used the word medium when he described that, but that's when I began to understand that the things that I was experiencing, not only were they real, but that I was different and there was nothing wrong with me. And I remember him having this long talk with me and saying, there's nothing wrong with you. You didn't do anything wrong. You're just different. Now, it took me decades to completely understand what he meant by that. But the seed was planted. Now, I was with Steve for about 17 years. He had some health problems, so I helped him along during that. And during that period, I lost a sister to a horrible crime, but it took me a long time before I was able to communicate with her. So that was really difficult. Now, some of the things that would happen during the time I spent time with Steve, for example, when I would fall asleep, and it still happens today, I would have many psychic experiences and visions, and I just thought that's what would happen. Steve explained to me, no, those are psychic experiences and sometimes people from spirit communicating with you. I was, again, floored. Like, really? That's what it is? Oh my God. So he taught me about mediumship, transfiguration, apport, psychic surgery. When he used to go to the Philippines a lot, he told me about Atlantis, UFOs, and all sorts of wonderful topics. So it was great. But the most important thing he taught me was to think outside of the box, to question everyone and everything. And just because our society or a clique of friends or your country or the medical people or the politicians or businesses says it's so, doesn't necessarily mean it's so. Think outside of the box, start fresh with an unbiased perspective. So during those years I spent with Steve, I lived nearby him. I saw something. There's a couple of things that I wrote down that were extraordinary that I'd like to share. One time he was very sick and I was staying over his house. He was in the bedroom and I was in the living room, and the fire was going. And I woke up and I saw him standing in front of the fireplace, except his body was, I could see his body was in his bed. So he had gotten out of his bed, his other body, his subtle body, was standing in front of the fireplace, but his body that was suffering was in bed. I told him about it the next day and he goes, "Oh, you saw that?" Like, that was as far as the discussion went. So apparently he really was doing that. He healed me of some ailments like leg pain. And on several occasions, I was also able to visit a spiritualist camp with him. The house that I lived in was built in 1880. And talk about the Fox sisters and rappings. Rappings went on all the time in the house. I remember the first time they started rapping on a paint bucket, a bucket of paint that we had in one of the rooms. And I said, "Can't be, this is ridiculous." And I threw the bucket out so I wouldn't hear it anymore. So then they started rapping on other parts of the house and I couldn't stop them. So that was constantly going on, something that I had to deal with. If I were praying, I often would have visions. I once had this incident where I was in a car accident. The night before the car accident, Spirit came to me twice in a dream. And in the dream, they showed me driving down a road, and I stop at this like bar restaurant, and I go in, and there's a policeman in there, and the policeman's dressed in complete white and full of light, and he says, "You can't go any further, you have to stop." And I said, no, I'm back and forth between New York and Connecticut, I gotta help my friend Steve, blah, blah, blah. "No, you don't understand, they're bad people, they'll hurt you, you can't go any further." I said, no, I'm gonna be fine, don't worry. So the next day I drive over to Steve's, and I'm supposed to leave around 7:30, and he didn't want me to leave for some reason, but I had to go eventually. I'm driving down right before the spot where the policeman told me to stop. A deer ran out in front of the car, and the car hit the deer, and the deer went up and over the car behind, and my car was pretty much demolished in the front. Now, the one thing I forgot to tell you, what happened was in that dream, the policeman also said, "Okay, we're going to put something in front of your car." So anyway, I was okay, but they had to tow the car away, and it was really scary, and my butt was saved by my spirit people, and somebody came through Steve and to tell me, "Next time, maybe you'll listen when we send you a warning." I would wake up in the middle of the night, and there would be Native Americans in my bedroom, like 5 or 6 of them. Another time, I would see lights around people, and sometimes just in the air. I was standing in the kitchen one day, and there was an egg on the counter, and the egg just rolled one way and then back. Lamps was moved one time. And by then I was beginning to come to know who my guides were, my inner band guides. And one of them, named Daisy, who is my joy guide, came to me in a dream, and she said, well, actually, let me back up. My father and my mother, due to what happened to my sister who had passed over, they took it very badly. So my father ended up with dementia. And so I used to weekly go and change his bed sheets for him because my mom wasn't feeling too well either. And I went to put it was one of these fitted sheets. So I went to put the fitted sheet on the front of the bed, and I turn around and the bed is all fitted in the back of the bed, like it's all already made. I said, what happened there? Like, that was really weird. So about 6 months go by, and I have this dream, and Daisy comes to me and she says, we're going to do it again. And I said, okay. So as I'm making the bed that time, I'm trying to look behind me to see what's going on. And I barely missed it, but I saw the sheet go up in the air and then come down and fold over the one corner of the bed. It also happened a third time, preceded by a dream. but it wasn't done as well, because the third time when she came to me, I said to her, I want to know how you do that. So they tried to show me it, but somehow my watching it interfered with the process of it happening. So, but that was interesting. Okay, so by then I knew who my inner band guides were, and there were other people that I was communicating with. In 26, Steve transitioned. He was older than me, so it was his time to go back home. And that's when I started to formally study mediumship and to practice at churches and on friends. Also during that period, I pursued a PhD in psychology and started teaching math and psychology on mostly the college and university level, and that lasted for about 17 years. My mom got sick with cancer, my father had dementia, so I became her caretaker. So at one point, I was caretaking, working, and studying for a PhD, and on the side when I could, taking classes on mediumship. This went on until about 2012 when my mother passed and they were able to get my father in a home. And then I moved to Connecticut. Soon after that, I was able to visit India. I got married in 2019. And then 2020, COVID hit. So I continued teaching online, but soon retired so I could focus on what I love doing most, which is mediumship. And that's around the time I joined Afterlife Research and Education Discussion, this group. So now what's happening is, at this point in my life, I'm doing private mediumship sessions and also classes. And in my classes, because I have a science background, I try to bring in some of the research findings on mediumship when possible. I still do sermons and platform work at a couple of local spiritualist churches. I've stopped teaching, but I do volunteer every semester to talk about mediumship and demonstrate message work to freshmen in a class studying about life after death at one of the universities I used to work at. And also sometimes I do volunteer work with a group of women who lost their grown adult children to drug overdoses, because it seems that I can help them connect to them and maybe smooth out some, and just say help them. That's a whole other topic to get into. And recently I've linked up with the Connecticut Death Coalition, who also do volunteer work with those who are either transitioning or their relatives who need help with that. I've also studied with Dr. Jane Bisler on LHC, Loving Heart Connections. So I had that experience, and I worked with some people on that, and that helped also to boost up my mediumship as well, believe it or not. So that's very good. I'm doing research on mediumship, writing about it and related subjects, and I've published in a couple of times in the National Natural Awakenings magazine, and also I wrote the foreword in a book by Dr. Vernon Neppy. Now, Dr. Neppy won honorable mention in the Bigelow contest. So my foreword is not on the Bigelow site, but it's in his book that that's based on the essay that he sent to Bigelow. I also joined the Parapsychological Association. I have some YouTube videos that I make every now and then. And at present, I'm trying to hone my skills in on trance, because I found the past few years, I suddenly will go into a trance state and people will come and talk through me. So I got hold of some people from the Spiritualist National Union International. I take classes with them, and this summer I'm going over to Arthur Findlay College in July to study with them to really get this down. And my mediumship has changed from to something that's very subtle and fine compared to what it used to be, but it may be more subtle and fine, but I hear them regularly. And it's very, very mental. There's very little wrappings and things like that, though occasionally some physical phenomena will happen. But I do believe that's more for the sake of my husband than it is for me, because I don't need to have physical phenomena anymore to know that there's life after death. I know the connection is all due to consciousness. I like to call it my mediumship now, the deep, tiny voice deep within myself that's greater than Mount Everest. The other thing I'm involved in is Yale University has been doing some research called two different research projects, Hope and the Belief Lab, and they're looking at the differences between psychic voice hearers or mediums who are voice hearers, they call us voice hearers, and schizophrenics who hear voices. And they want to find out what are the mediums and psychics doing that are different than the schizophrenics, because all the tests that they put us through, we come up healthy. We're not mentally ill. So what are the mediums and psychics doing, and what can they learn from that so that they can find new methods of treating people and new methods of diagnosing schizophrenia, maybe get away from some of those hard drugs. I was involved in 2 studies in the past few years, and I just started a 3rd one with them. And what they do is they use functional MRIs, electroencephalograms, and a variety of cognitive tests to observe the differences in us and the other group. By the way, they like to use the term disassociation when publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and voice hearers, just so you know, that's their buzzword. Interesting note is that one of the main researchers in the program, and she's also a professor and teaches at Yale, she was once diagnosed with schizophrenia until someone at work told her, no, who was a medium, told her, no, you're not schizophrenic, you're just picking up on energies. And then she went to some place where they teach mediumship and got rid of her diagnosis, and now she researches mediumship in laboratories. So I could go into some more physical phenomena that's happened, but I'd rather not, and I'd rather just open everything up to questions, because that's about a half an hour, I think.